Allow me to give just a really brief introduction to today's program. My name is Grace DeWitt, and I am the National and International Outreach Programs Coordinator at the National Museum of Women in the Arts. I'm so happy to welcome you to this third virtual artist panel for our upcoming exhibition, New Worlds, Women to Watch 2024. New Worlds features 28 contemporary artists from across the US and around the world, and the show opens at our museum in Washington, D.C. this coming April. I have the pleasure of working with the museum's network of 31 outreach committees. These committees are groups of NIMWA members who advance our mission for gender equity in the arts through grassroots programming and audience building in their respective regions. They really do extend the mission of our museum far beyond our walls in Washington, and we're most grateful. Women to Watch is an exhibition series designed by NIMWA in collaboration with its national and international committees. And my colleague Jenny will go over Women to Watch in greater detail. Jenny Trainer is Senior Curator at the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and she, along with Associate Curator Aureen Zara, is one of the co-curators of New Worlds, Women to Watch 2024. It is a true privilege to hear from Jenny and from some of the artists in New Worlds today. Jenny, I will hand the mic over to you.
Thank you, Grace, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I can see we have a really good number of participants today, which is really exciting. Maybe many other people in the DMV are snowed in, as I am. And it's very cold here, so I think we're all hunkering down at home. It's really, really my pleasure to be here with you today and to speak with three of the artists that are in the Women to Watch exhibition. And before I introduce them, I just want to briefly outline for everyone tuning in the Women to Watch exhibition series and the current iteration, New Worlds. So as Grace mentioned, Women to Watch is an exhibition series that is based on where we have these outreach committees. And we work with the committees and curators in their regions to identify artists in their regions who are working in a particular theme. Now, in the past, this theme has centered on material. So we've done exhibitions on works in metal, works made out of paper, fiber. But Aureen and I were tasked with coming up with the theme for Women to Watch 2024 when we were preparing to open Women to Watch 2020, and we all know what happened in 2020. So we were in that moment of uncertainty, and we thought, you know, any exhibition that we're planning for the future, we really wanted to incorporate all of the things that were kind of swirling around at that time. So that was not only the pandemic, but it was this kind of unprecedented political divide in the United States. It was calls for social justice reform in the US and abroad. And rather than an exhibition about any one of those things, we thought, what could we do that would kind of tap into that, but also explore kind of different ways of thinking about things. And so we came up with this idea of New Worlds. And we really wanted to look at what artists were doing, how they were thinking about not only the future, but also the present moment that we were and are in, and also how they look back to the past. So that was kind of the genesis of the theme for this 2024 Women to Watch. As we worked with curators in these regions, identifying artists and selecting the artists, we were really working to create a cohesive exhibition. So it really was not about picking, you know, the best artist out of the 3 to 5 that were submitted. It was really for us about selecting artists whose works were in conversation with one another and that were touching on the themes that we had identified. So today's program is focusing on one of the sub-themes that has emerged in the course of curating New Worlds Women to Watch 2024, and that is ecologies. And very loosely defined, ecology can be defined as the relationship among living organisms and their environments. And of course, living organisms includes humans. And the study of ecology considers these organisms at the individual level, wider population levels, communities, ecosystems, and even down to the biosphere level. And so the artists that we asked to join us today all work kind of at the intersection of these things. I do want to note that unfortunately our artist representing our UK committee, Noemi Goodall, is unable to join us today due to illness. So we wish her speedy recovery. I will speak a little bit to her work, and I hope I do it justice. So very briefly, I would like to introduce all of the artists that are joining us here today. And I'll talk a little bit more about Noemi's biography when I speak to her work. So joining us today, we have Irina Kirchuk from Argentina. She lives and works in Buenos Aires, where she sources materials from the urban landscape to create works that question the world that we have built for ourselves, using those very items that we have used to build it. We are also joined by Sarah Ortegon Highwalking, who is our Wyoming committee artist. She splits her time between Wyoming and Denver and is an actress and dancer as well as a visual artist. She is Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho, identities which inform all of her practices. Her work in Women to Watch centers on the relationship of humans and the environment and the hope for a better relationship in the future, using the past as a guide. And from Germany, we have Sophia Pomperi, who lives and works in Berlin. And she studied sculpture at the Kunsthochschule in Berlin, Wissensee. She works with installations, video, and photography that are rooted in observations that lead viewers to question their beliefs about reality. And in the case of her work in Women to Watch, engages with the fragility of humans to truly understand their world. So welcome to all three of you. It's really, really a pleasure to have you here. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And as I noted, I have everyone listed in alphabetical order. So that means that Noemi was due to go first. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, she's not here. So I am going to do my best to speak to her work very briefly. And then we will hear from, in order, Irina, Sarah, and Sophia. All right. Okay. So Noemi Goodall is a French artist, but she studied in the UK. She graduated from the Royal College of Art in London in 2010. And her work really operates at the intersection of ecology and anthropology. She works in photography and film, and she manipulates them to explore, most recently, paleological time. So this idea of deep time. What we are looking at here is a work that will be in the exhibition. It's called Phoenix 5, and you can see it's an inkjet print. So it's a photograph for all intents and purposes. But what is a little bit difficult to tell from this image is the kind of manipulation of reality that's happening here. And to give you a little bit of an idea of how she makes these works, I'm showing you a process image. So here we are looking at, bear with me as I try to explain this. We are in a jungle. So she's traveled to a site, that's very kind of tropical site, this jungle. And you can see in the foreground here, hopefully you can see my cursor, on a frame here, she has suspended strips of a photograph of the jungle. So this is, she's taken photographs of the jungle, she's printed it, she's cut it up, and then suspended it in front of the actual jungle. And so what we see here, while it kind of looks like this collaged photograph, is in reality a picture of those strips in front of the real flora and fauna, right, in front of the real trees. So Noemi's work is really interested in getting at this idea of ecological time, of deep time, and really trying to bridge the gap between our kind of human understanding of time and the Earth's understanding of time, if you will. We also have a film by her in the exhibition, and pardon me while I stop sharing for just a moment and then reshare. I just want to show you a very brief clip of this video where it's kind of the same concept, but as I play it, can you hear the soundtrack? There is kind of birds chirping, insects, and we can see smoke and fire at the bottom. And as it continues, you see that what is actually burning is the photograph of image of the jungle that she's taken. Let me put this one. So in the film, it's a little bit different. What she's done is, again, printed. She's printed images again of the actual jungle, and then she's hung them in her studio. And I think there were for the film there are 9 different layers. And she's burning them consecutively to reveal the layer behind, to reveal the layer behind, to reveal the layer of time behind. And so again, this idea of exposing what lies beneath, using fire that is both a destructive force, but as we know, also a generative force. We know that forests need to burn once every so often to begin again, to grow anew. And so by manipulating reality in this way, in her photographs and in her films, again, Noemi is really trying to bridge the gap between our understanding of time as we perceive it and this paleological time, if you will. I apologize in advance to Noemi because I'm sure she could have done a much better job of explaining her work than I have, but I think I've captured the gist of it. They're really stunning works. This is actually quite large print that will be in the exhibition, and we will be projecting the film as well. And I think this kind of immersive quality is also key to Noemi's work, which unfortunately is something that you can't get on screen. So if you can, come see them in person in the exhibition. So that's a little bit about Noemi's work, and I'm going to move ahead now to Irina's work and invite her to speak about her work. Irina will be speaking in Spanish, and again, if you prefer to listen in English, you can select that option at the bottom of your screen. Irina.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Aquí desde Buenos Aires, desde el verano de la ciudad, todos con frío, acá con mucho calor. Bueno, en principio me gustaría contarles un poco acerca de esta pieza que está mostrando Ginny, que es la pieza que se va a mostrar en el museo, en la exhibición. Esta obra forma parte de una serie de varias, de una serie que he hecho de estas piezas de diferentes colores. La obra trata de, digamos, 2 mallas metálicas que aprisionan pedazos de goma espuma. y aluden a ciertos tipos de cerramientos de puertas y ventanas que se encuentran en las ciudades. A veces uno puede ver cómo se cierran las puertas o cómo se cierran ciertas almacenes y locales de una manera como muy informal. Entonces esto tiene que ver un poco con ese paisaje de la ciudad. Pero a su vez intentaba con este trabajo hacer una cita al juego Tetris, por eso la pieza se llama Tetris 2, es como un Tetris imposible, porque las gomespumas son totalmente irregulares, entonces es una obra que tiene cierta connotación sobre la geometría y el arte concreto latinoamericano, pero a su vez tiene una irregularidad absoluta y nunca nunca logran las piezas caer, eh, digamos, regularmente entre sí. Y por último, sobre esta pieza particular, que por ahí aquí en la imagen no se ve en detalle, son dos mallas metálicas que aprietan muy fuertemente estas goma espumas. Entonces esta goma espuma sale, rebalsa eh, la malla metálica y de este modo se produce como una cierta operación escultórica muy clásica, ¿no? Que es como la compresión de dos materiales. Y la cuestión cromática no es menor en esta pieza y en toda mi obra. Es una manera de, digamos, llevar a un plano de fantasía y más surrealismo para ser sintética estos paisajes urbanos con los que trabajo. Y luego, en relación a este panel de hoy y a este tema sobre ecologies especialmente, eh, me apunté unos temas que me pareció interesante en este encruzamiento que presentó Ginny, que no sé si quieren pasar estas otras dos imágenes. Estas otras dos imágenes son más de obras mías de carácter instalativo, una pieza en Londres, en un lugar que se llama Bold Tendencies, y otra, la segunda imagen, en una galería en el barrio de La Boca, en Buenos Aires, un barrio muy popular cerca del río. Una es una instalación para exterior y otra es una galería de arte. Me interesaba mostrar dos imágenes que muestren digamos, una convivencia de varias obras mías en esta especie de escena que se arma. Y me anoté, digamos, para ser sintética y para relacionar con el tema que nos une, algunos temas sobre el uso del objeto recolectado, que es una de las prácticas más habituales en mi taller, en mi estudio. Yo trabajo a partir del objeto recolectado, trabajo a partir del paisaje urbano, tanto con la intervención de objetos recolectados y clasificados, como con la producción de dispositivos nuevos. Pero específicamente sobre el objeto recolectado, digamos, las razones o el interés o las cuestiones que me interesan destacar acerca de este tema es que considero, digamos, a la ciudad o al paisaje de ciudad como un organismo vivo, donde coexisten todos estos objetos y estos materiales. Dentro de este organismo vivo es de donde yo recolecto por la calle toda la basura que se encuentra en la calle. Con eso trabajo. O sea que la ciudad me da como muchas capas, es como un paisaje con muchas capas y me interesa ir combinando esas capas de diferente modo, o cambiándolas de escala, o armando alguna escultura más pequeña o más grande, etc. La idea del objeto como lo intrascendente, un mundo lleno de cosas con una obsolescencia material y una funcionalidad mezquina. O sea, ¿para qué? Esa idea de sentir que necesitamos un montón de cosas que en definitiva no tienen ese tal valor. Como tercer punto, el objeto como lo común, como algo común y como un gran archivo social, como la historia emocional colectiva. Ese es otro de los puntos por los que me interesa trabajar con el objeto urbano, y por eso también no me interesa trastocarlo de una manera tan radical a como el espectador lo puede reconocer. Como cuarto punto, el uso del objeto como una economía de recursos en contraposición a la idea de ecología. Porque, digamos, no es solo una economía de recursos porque uno se ahorra un material porque lo consigue en la calle, sino economía de recursos. También me refiero a que a la posibilidad de observar el descarte como una descripción de nuestras propias acciones económicas. Obviamente también en países como Argentina y como varios países de Sudamérica, trabajar con lo que uno tiene es parte del modus operandi, porque obviamente la escultura tiene un costo de producción muy alto y trabajar con el objeto es sobre todo también una cuestión económica, no solo ecológica. Y por último, la idea de la ciudad como un teatro, los objetos como seres vivos animados, que eso es un poco lo que me interesa en mi escultura a partir del color, del minimalismo, del diseño, convertir este universo, este paisaje, esta ciudad, este cosmos, en una especie de teatro donde estos objetos cobran vida. Y tomar estas esculturas que yo siempre digo que en la calle ya se comenzaron, alguien las comenzó y yo solo las continúo en mi estudio. No sé si estuvo claro, que quise como contar un poco como diferentes puntos de vista de por qué uno trabaja con estos materiales, no solo desde el punto de vista simplemente como de reutilización o de ecología, sino en un sentido un poco más amplio de el paisaje de la ciudad como un organismo vivo, la idea de teatro, la idea de lo intrascendente, bueno, diferentes aspectos que hacen como a esta idea de recolección. Bueno, me
Thank
despido
you,
por
Irina.
ahora.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think that was very well explained, and hearing you speak about it, I
De
was starting
nada.
to see some more connections between your work and Noemi's work, and even I think with Sarah's work. So I'll ask you guys about that when everyone's finished presenting. Sarah, I'd love to hear about your work.
Okay.
Hello, I'm just going to introduce myself in my traditional language, which is Arapaho. Dos nana asenon nakabase hinono et. Hello, my name's Sarah Ortegon. I am Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho. And the pieces that you see here, so I use multiple different types of, how would you say, mediums. But typically I will create a painting and then I will add traditional beadwork onto the painting. But what a lot of people don't know is that beadwork actually comes from quill work. And so what we used to do was take the pine needles from porcupine, and then what you do is you flatten it out, and then you're able to twist it around a material, and it creates a design. And you could dye the porcupine quills. And so a lot of our patterns that we traditionally had came from porcupine work. Quill work is what we call it. But however, with the coming of the Europeans, we started to trade, and that's where beads came into play. And so my work ties back to history, but also bringing it forward into our traditional regalia that we wear today. The image that you see there is a jingle dress, which came about in the early 1900s. And that was due to the first recorded American pandemic, the Spanish flu, that influenza, that's what they called it. And it originally came from the Ojibwe / Anishinaabe. They love to be called their traditional name, which is the Anishinaabe people. And it came through a dream from a traditional man who had asked for guidance on how to save his daughter from this sickness, and he received this dress in his dream, and the cones were created from tobacco can lids historically. Now they are not, but we use tobacco in order to we intake the smoke, and the smoke goes out to the creator, and we believe that our prayers are carried with the smoke. And so with this painting that I created, I wanted to talk about the removal of our physical selves from a space while also acknowledging the spiritual existence of who we are as people. And that's not to force those opinions on anyone. This is just how I see the world. And how powerful our remaining energies are within a space. And so I wanted to show the movement that our energies create, even without our physical existence within them. And then the lower piece that you see is a cradle board that I actually created with for my son. He did use it. And we used to use, traditionally we used cedar, and we also used willows, because willows, I don't know if you know, they are a medicine plant, and willows actually where you get aspirin from. So if you were to chew on a willow bark, and if you had a toothache, then that would help with the pain that's happening in your mouth. It's a painkiller, but it's also really light. And so what they used to do is they used to cut the willows down, dry them out, and then weave them together to create the backboard of the cradle board. I did not do that here, but that's the traditional way in which we used to make the cradle boards. And because it was light to carry the baby, and we used to hang the baby in the cradle board on a tree while we were, working on our hides or anything that we used to do around camp. And on top of it, I put so much beadwork on top that you can't see here, but it's also a historic tie back to the strength that I want my son to have. He's a year and 8 months now, but the top of it is a circle, and then within that circle there's lines, and it's just talking about the years of his life, and how the top of a baby's head is soft, and how they're receiving a lot of spiritual intake still, whereas when we're grown adults within my tradition, your skull kind of melts together, and the spirituality can be shut off if you don't continue to work on it. And then I integrated the ties to hold my son in. But what I'm doing here, and what I want to do, is show that our teachings that we've had traditionally, and how they could create a pathway into us relating back to the land that we used to take care of. We were stewards of the land. We weren't just consuming everything around us all the time. And these pieces, they take a really long time to make, because beadwork, the painting will be done within, a few days. But when it comes to the beadwork, sometimes it could take weeks. And the beadwork also depends on how are you feeling. If you are feeling in any sort of way negative, or not really feeling it that day, then that energy, we believe, also goes into the creation of that piece. And so just the way in which traditionally we used to move as a people wasn't fast. Europeans brought over wheels, right, which created cars, which made us go fast, which moved into airplanes. And I'm not saying that all these things are bad, but this makes us think in fast motion, fast pace. We got to be here. We got to make sure we're on time. And time to us in that era, it was more of what happens is what is meant to happen. And time wasn't linear. It was there was multiple ways to travel in between our realm and different realms, such as sweat lodges and things like that. And so, and I used to actually lead outdoor excursions went in Wyoming for up to 30 days, and all we had was our backpack, and we had to learn how to relate to the outdoors, and how not to just escape it within square walls, which also I believe kind of cuts off our ability to think outside of the lines. And so so that's kind of what my art relates to. I actually just created a really large installation piece in Lafayette, Colorado, called writers. And within that piece, it gives it's like 30 feet tall, and I can't remember how wide at the moment, but it's a big installation piece, and along the wall it tells the timeline of how animals used to roam the plains, and how the buffalo massacre and how that changed the landscape of where we are. It completely changed the landscape because it voided the impact that the buffalo had on the area. Even their footsteps created little wallows for water for animals to come and drink water. When that disappears, the water just runs off, and then it creates mud. And so those are all just the little changes that I believe that if we connect back into our past, we could bring that knowledge back into the future and live happily with our surroundings, rather than cutting off and separating ourselves from it. So thank you for giving me the time, and thank you for listening. I'm sorry if I went over.
You're fine. How can I not work the mute button yet? No, that was beautiful, Sarah. Thank you so much. I love hearing that reflection you had about time and kind of how things, seem to move so quickly now. And again, I'm seeing some really interesting connections with your work, with Noemi's, and I think with Sophia's as well, that we'll hear about now. Sophia, would you like to tell us about your work?
Thank you, Ginny. Thank you, Grace, for organizing this panel. I'm very much excited, as this exhibition will be my first appearance in the state. I'm Sophia Pamperi, born in Berlin with Hungarian roots. Lived sometimes in St. Petersburg, Russia, and in Istanbul, Turkey, but then returned to Berlin. And you told me in advance that I had 3 minutes to speak, so I was like, how could I put it in a nutshell and characterize my work in one sentence? And it's like, there's a fine line between attention to detail and obsession with detail, an extremely precise fine line. I think the sentence would characterize my work best. So you see, I have a joy in observing and measuring things, and I like to question general assumptions, like, for instance, gravity is nice, but maybe it's just a habit. So we can take it topsy-turvy and change our perspectives. And I have an interest in physics and philosophy, and I like to transform familiar objects such as household items, maps, or measuring instruments into metaphors. Now, we face times where we hear a lot about climate change, and of course this is also an issue which interests me a lot. And if we talk about that, then there's always a number coming back again and again. This is like the 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit of increase of the heat. And so if you speak about or 1 degree Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, this is a nice number, but what does this mean actually? How much is this in meters or an inch? How can we find the image for that? The sea level rises, but how does that look like? How much land is taken away, or So my current project focuses on this balance of power between physical laws and mankind and environment. And thinking about climate issues, I think there's a crucial contradiction, because it is totally existential to understand this epochal impact of climate change. But on the other side, there's a subjective perspective. And on the subjective perspective, this is almost impossible, because our perspective is limited to the sphere of our experience. That means that somehow our reference point is the region where we live in, or the people we know, and also our lifespan. And this is just too narrow to understand that this climate issue is a global thing, and the epochal change is epochal. This is much more than our lifespan, right? So this is a global phenomenon, and well, the epoch affected by these effects exceeds our rather short lifespan. So we can measure this change, and we have a lot of statistics like data and probability calculations, but in the end we fail being empathetic. So climate change is too global and too epochal for us to understand, while we have a very narrow personal perspective. So we cannot understand it, we cannot comprehend it, and our perspective is too limited. So my aim in my artistic work is to capture this fragility of human scales. I think it's a beautiful failure. I create photos, objects, and installations in an experimental setup. And for the New Worlds exhibition, I intend to show the work you see on the screen. It's entitled Floods. You see a deep, dark circle, which is perforated. It has some holes in it. It's pitted at the edge. And if you look close to it, then it turns out that actually it's not like random holes, but it's a map. It's a physical map of the North Pole with the light pollution of the adjacent continents. So we see the Arctic night, and every hole corresponds to a settlement or a city. And actually the light pollution burning the Arctic night. On top of the circle, there's a chaotic pile of alignment rods. It looks quite playful. In German, it's called Mikado. Grace, you corrected me. The English term was, I think, pickup sticks. You know, this children game. So it looks quite playful, but in the end, so why did I include these rods? These surveying rods, usually this is the first thing you use when you want to start to conquer a piece of land. So the first thing you use when entering a new territory is to measure this land. And we are facing times where light pollution constantly increases in the Arctic night in correlation to the global warming, because the permafrost ground isn't frosty anymore, so we can settle further north and exploit more territories in the north. And I would like to show this work together with another work. Ginny, would it be possible that I share the screen, because I think it is missing in this presentation? So I would quickly, I think you have to end this presentation, and then I would just open
Yes.
mine, if this is possible.
Yep.
Yeah, so these are these alignment rods, the floods, and I would like to show this work together with this photography, or one of these photographies. It's a long time exposure of a shop that is selling children globes. You might know them, you know, you can have that as a light close to the bed of a child. And so these are yeah, it's a kind of lamp, a kind of globes. And I took a long time exposure of this shop window. And taking this long time exposure, it sets everything white on, it sets everything on 0, and the earth shines as a homogeneously white surface. It's like a glowing sphere. And somehow it's like burning holes into the photography. And I think this aspect of burning something into the dark, this is something in common with this installation. Yeah, so first I was saying gravity is just a habit, but in the end, the measurement of the world is based on agreement, and it is up to us to accept the tools for it, or rather to find a completely different use, and how it's, in the end, it's a question how we play with our resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm doubly disappointed that Noemi is not here to join us, because I think there is such a connection, Sophia, between your work and her work. And it strikes me that we have in our group here, Sophia and Noemi dealing with these issues of vast, kind of almost incomprehensible expanses of time, and the environment of the planet. And then with Sarah and Irina's work, it is much more on a human scale, this idea of time. I want to ask a question of Sarah and Irina first, but then come back to you, Sophia, to get your take on this. So Irina and Sarah, in your work, you know, you're dealing with these issues of our environments, our human environments, and also how the humans interact with the world around them. And I detect in each of your work, you know, these are very important questions, and they're big questions, and they're serious questions. But in your work, Irina and Sarah, I detect an element of hope and of joy as well. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. And Irina, maybe we'll hear from you first. This element of playfulness in your work.
Sí. Es curioso que me preguntes sobre este aspecto de la esperanza, porque en este momento estoy participando en una exposición en el Museo de Arte Moderno de Buenos Aires sobre una mirada de la ciudad, donde nos invitaron a artistas del año 2000, digamos que empezamos a trabajar más en esa época, y la curadora de esa exposición, en Argentina hubo una crisis económica muy grande en el año 2001. Entonces, esta muestra, digamos que recorre desde el año 2001 hasta la actualidad ciertas miradas sobre lo urbano o sobre la ciudad, y empieza de una manera muy, muy hostil, muy tremenda esa mirada de la ciudad, y termina la muestra, no termina, tiene bastantes puntos de vista, ¿no? Pero hay un sector que estoy yo con otros artistas más en una especie de como de mirada más alegre o más esperanzadora sobre la ciudad. Yo creo que más que esperanzadora, a la hora de trabajar, mi obra tiene un punto de vista bastante sarcástico e irónico. Y por otro lado, considero que en el arte, digamos, desde la producción individual de cada uno, uno no va a tener como una solución, o no va a dar un manifiesto tan claro sobre lo que sería ideal para este ambiente y para el futuro de este ecosistema. Por lo tanto, desde mi humilde práctica, me interesa generar como esta especie como estos paisajes como más entre irónicos, surrealistas, donde se ponga a través del absurdo, donde se ponga en jaque esa adicción al consumo y a esta necesidad del objeto industrial masivo, o como donde se ponga, donde rápidamente uno vea cómo todo ese mundo material puede convertirse en una especie de gran escenografía teatral sin sentido, ¿no? Es como algo así, pero no me animaría a decir que desde mi trabajo quiero proponer una salida o tengo claro cómo sería una posibilidad, porque no lo sé, porque sería mentira, ¿no? Pero sí me puedo llegar a acercar a algo que tiene que ver con una intuición y que tiene que ver con recorrer diferentes ciudades trabajando, y sobre todo las ciudades latinoamericanas, que tienen una escala, bueno, muy similar a Estados Unidos. Son ciudades muy grandes, donde uno puede ver diferentes realidades, no solo, digamos, la pequeña burguesía con sus comodidades. Entonces creo que es como poner un poco en juego, poner un poco en jaque esa cuestión. Y por otro lado también el hecho de trabajar con materiales tan reconocibles, y hacer que la obra no tenga un carácter tan metafórico, sino que sea una obra directa, una obra de acceso directo, es otro punto que me parece importante como para trabajar con diferentes tipos de público, y que esta cuestión de las ecologías, los ecosistemas, las crisis climáticas sean accesibles. O sea que a partir de mi obra, como que a mí me pasa mucho que las personas que no están por ahí en el mundo del arte pueden como acceder rápidamente al trabajo, ¿no? Porque reconocen absolutamente todo lo que, todo con lo que se está trabajando. No sé si respondí exacto a tu pregunta, Ginny, pero un poco creo que me acerqué.
Yeah, no, thank you, Irina. I think it's this element, and I think this underpins a lot of the work we've discussed today, this element of shifting perspective and different ways of
Mhm.
thinking about things, either new ways of thinking about things, or Sarah, in your case, maybe returning to historical ways of thinking about things. And one of the things I really love about your work is this this element of hope in it. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. So there have been studies on historic trauma and how that plays into your bloodline. And I think that in order to go forward, you have to focus on hope, on my people have survived genocide, and it wasn't an accident that these things happened to us. It was on purpose. And so we had to have hope in order to move forward into the future. And I think that hope, that the generational trauma doesn't only exist as trauma, but it also exists as a hope within our bloodlines. And that I hope that my son lives a happier life than I have lived, because I am trying to break generational traumas, and show him a different type of life by returning back to what was taken from us, our languages, our spiritual beliefs, and whatever he wants to do, I want to support him in that. And so to me, the future is our children. And so I find hope in him every day. And so I want to show that within my art, and to give that sense of still existing, but not just existing, being happy in our existence, as a human society. So
Thank you. Yeah, and existing, hopefully more in tune with our surrounding environments, whether that's the natural world or the urban environment, I would imagine. Sophia, I think I'd like to pose the same question to you. I mean, your work is, again, concerned with certain ecological impacts of human activity. And I think ultimately kind of you were speaking about, the way that we comprehend things, or the way that we measure these things, right? We have to, as humans, we have to agree upon them. And there's almost a sense of futility there in terms of how are we ever going to understand these big existential issues with our limited time here on the planet. But is there an element of hope at all in your work? And if so, how do you think that comes through?
I hope so. I mean, yeah, it's black and white, these two examples which I've shown. So, but actually, I think I don't like to be didactic, showing my political opinion. I like to create works where I hope that they have several layers of meaning. And also for these two works, as for some others, I use some things that we know from childhood, or like which are tools from children, and I think there's also the moment where I can relate to what Sarah just said. I have a son who's 4, and I think this is the moment where hope comes in. And this is also a clear motivation for me to address these issues about climate, because I think these are my tools, and this is what I can do in the current situation.
And we have a question
But
that
actually, so it's for me, it's important that it has some playfulness, you know. It should not be so very, you know, I mean, of course, these issues are severe and it's important and so on, but on the same time, the work should have some lightness, you know, and it should be playful and also create joy.
yeah, and I
I try
think
to bridge this somehow. I don't know whether this works out. I mean, this is what I try to.
yeah, I think, you know, when you mentioned the rods that are on top of the map of the Arctic, you know, kind of referencing the children's game of Mikado or pickup sticks. And I think there is that not only element of playfulness, but also the element of kind of haphazardness,
Mhm.
right, in so many things in life, and maybe in the environment too. We have a question from one of our participants that I want to pose to all of you. We have about 6 more minutes left. And they are wondering about your influences and how you came to work in this area. Like, what spurred your interest in ecologies writ large? So your interest in humans and their environments. I think Sarah, if you want to go first.
Yeah. So I remember when I was growing up, I was pretty close. My mom and dad had 12 kids. And at that time, my dad was a preacher. And so I lived under a very strict household. And the only time that I had freedom was when we traveled to the reservation, and my dad would drop us off with our auntie and uncle for the summer. And we would just go and play in the rivers and play on dirt mounds and just connect to our environment in that way. And so that's where my relationship with ecology started. And that's when I felt the most alive as a human being. And I think that that had to translate somehow into my artwork. And I do believe that the landscapes that I create in my artwork play back into I have a series of different indigenous women throughout the world where I paint their image, but then next to that on a it's like a diptych, I add in the landscape that they came from and what basically molded them to be strong. Because in anytime you're outside, it's you are just at will to whatever happens outside, right? The wind or the snow, the rain. Unless you're prepared, you're just going to just experience all of the discomfort that it brings. Sometimes there's too much sun. And so, and as a child, you don't care about those things. You'll just play outside in the rain. It doesn't matter. And I think that as we grow older into our adulthood, we want to become more sheltered. And that's just something that I've seen and something that I believe plays into my artwork. Yeah.
Thank you. You painted a beautiful picture of of your childhood. It sounds amazing.
Sí.
Irina, how about you? How did you come to work on these topics? Oh, sorry, Irina, I think you're muted.
Ahí está. Desde muy pequeña, yo nací aquí en Buenos Aires y desde muy pequeña coleccionaba objetos y empezaba a acumular objetos, no como los reality shows que acumulan objetos, no desde ese punto de vista, pero sí tenía como un interés especial por las cosas que nos rodeaban y por la memoria de esas cosas que nos rodeaban y por ese afecto como de lo doméstico en cada hogar. Mi abuela tenía también esta relación con las cosas muy similares, ella era transportista escolar, llevaba niños de acá para allá cuando vivía y siempre me conseguía alguna cosa y para guardarme. Mi padre, arquitecto, también, siempre en relación con los objetos, una familia bastante, mi madre también arquitecta, siempre en relación con esta mirada de la ciudad desde muy pequeña, ¿no? Entonces, y yo naturalmente empecé a coleccionar objetos, y cuando mi interés, digamos, empezó a hacer escultura específicamente, yo hice escultura tradicional durante varios años, hasta que me di cuenta, escultura tradicional me refiero a yeso, arcilla, cemento, como materiales más clásicos, y empecé a utilizar toda esta colección de objetos que me rodeaban y me permitía trabajar con la tridimensión de una manera como muy inmediata, muy práctica, y con esta relación con el paisaje que me empezó a interesar. Y en cuanto a eso ecológico, digamos, que empezó a suceder, pasó algo que tiene que ver con que no le vi después más sentido a generar nuevos materiales que los que ya existían. Me parecía que había una cantidad de materiales existentes que era en exceso, y eso que en las ciudades como Buenos Aires se rompe una mesa y se repara la mesa, no se compra otra mesa en IKEA, como pasa por ahí en algunos países. Acá se restaura todo, ¿no? Como que hay un culto, hay una cultura de la restauración. Sin embargo, se ve en la calle una cantidad de basura absurda, ¿no? Entonces también me empezó a pasar esta cuestión de necesitar cada vez un estudio más grande, porque cada vez tengo una colección de cosas más grandes, y a la hora de tener una exhibición yo no necesito materiales, sino que me propongo trabajar con eso que existe, ¿no? Como una cuestión sí, como de economía absoluta. Y después, a lo largo de la carrera, por suerte, tuve la posibilidad de viajar bastante haciendo otras exhibiciones, y no tengo que hacer transporte de obra ni trasladar obra en muchos casos, porque he trabajado con la basura de cada lugar donde voy. O sea que me he convertido como en una especie de experta en la basura de diferentes ciudades, y eso es particular conocer un lugar a partir de su basura. Por eso antes les hablaba de lo económico, la idea de lo económico, ¿no? Porque uno reconoce aspectos sociales, bueno, un montón de cuestiones. Siempre hablando, no tanto como desde el aspecto de la naturaleza y esa conexión con la naturaleza, como comentaba Sara, sino más desde este aspecto de los centros urbanos masivos y desde las periferias latinoamericanas, que son muy intensas y con un nivel de pobreza muy alto también, ¿no? Donde esta idea de la basura también es un valor económico, digamos. Que yo utilice basura para hacer una obra de arte es casi un lujo en Latinoamérica, porque hay otra gente que vende esa basura para sobrevivir. Entonces hay como ciertos aspectos que son bastante delicados, ¿no?
Yeah, thank you. It sounds like it was
Pero,
fittingly your environment that that encouraged you to go where you are today. And Sophia, I will give the last word to you about your how you came to work on these topics.
I used to be artist in residence at on an island in the north of Germany, close to the Dutch border. It's very idyllic, beautiful houses with these thatched roofs, you know, it's super nice. And I learned that there has been a storm surge in the medieval times, which detached this island from the land, and many people died. It's called große Mannstränke, something like big man drowning, which I found really funny, because there's this man, so where are the women? They died as well. It's strange, but this had been in 1300 something. And then I was just fascinated, like, how is it possible that 2/3 of the land disappears just in a storm surge or in a big flood? You know, how is this possible? And then I just learned that actually it was not this Atlantis of the North or something, which became a myth. It wasn't this one effect of having this flood, but it was actually interplay of different forces. Like there was temperature increase, there was an economic crisis before that, there had been a war and a plague, and the people were just not able to maintain the dikes to protect themselves from the sea, because, you know, they died in the plague or in the war, and also temperature was a problem, was winter time and so on. So there wasn't the force to maintain, and then there came this big flood, and actually people, they were frozen. They were not drowning, but they were frozen because it was winter time. And then I just realized that actually we are in a similar time, because we face a change in the temperature, and there is an economic issue also all around the world. Also politically, it's uncertain times. In Europe, we are close to the Ukraine, we feel this war and so on. And then also there was this corona pandemic. So there's this interplay of different forces. And the question is, when is the tipping point? So now we still could adapt for this climate change, but when is the moment when there will be a fatigue and we will not be able anymore to adapt ourselves? So this made me think, and it was a really strange moment because this island is so idyllic and the nature is beautiful and the houses are so nice. So, yeah, so this was a very crucial moment for me.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about how such an idyllic place can be the is not sheltered, is not shielded from the effects of any of these things. Well, we've gone a little bit over time. Thank you everyone who has stuck with us. Thank you so much, Irina, Sophia, and Sarah, for joining us today. It was an absolute pleasure speaking with you. And I am so excited to show your work in Washington and New Worlds Women to Watch 2024. Grace, is there anything that you would like to say as we close out?
Sure, I'd love to take this a last moment here. Thank you again, Irina, Sarah, Sophia, for sharing your visions of New Worlds with us, and of course, in spirit to Noemi as well. I want to thank you, Jenny, for moderating this really generative conversation, and to Valentina, Francisco, and Joy for facilitating the conversation with their language surfaces. I have to thank my colleagues at the National Museum of Women in the Arts for helping to organize this program, and of course, NIMWA's outreach committees who partner with our museum on the ambitious Women to Watch series. In particular, thank you to the leaders and members of the museum's committees in Argentina, Germany, the UK, and the state of Wyoming. They have made it possible for today's featured artists to participate in New Worlds. We could not be more appreciative. Lastly, thank you to our museum members that are online and have been part of this great conversation. Thank you for your enthusiasm and support, and you really do drive our exhibitions, programs like these, and this larger global endeavor for gender equity in the arts. So thank you. I've copied in the link to the next chat in this webinar series in the Zoom chat below, and I just wanted to mention that conversation is titled New Worlds, Historicisms, and Futurisms. It will be on Wednesday, February 14th, again from 12 noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're in the US, maybe bring a date. It'll be a great day for that. And in this panel, artists will discuss how the past, present, and future collide in their work. Again, the link is there. Thank you all so much for being here from all of your many different time zones. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.